We continue Plutarch's Lies, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough, with Sertorius. It is no great wonder if in long process of time, while fortune takes her course hither and thither, numerous coincidences should spontaneously occur. If the number and variety of subjects to be wrought upon be infinite, it is all the more easy for fortune, with such an abundance of material, to effect this similarity of results. Or if, on the other hand, events are limited to the combinations of some finite number, then of necessity the same must often recur, and in the same sequence. I would think the other would make it more likely, but there are, if there's no limit, you're bound to have things repeat themselves more than if there's a limit, right? There are people who take a pleasure in making collections of all such fortuitous occurrences that they have heard or read of, as look like works of irrational power and design. They observe, for example, that the two eminent persons whose names were Etis, the one a Syrian, the other of Arcadia, were both slain by a wild boar. That of two whose names were Actaeon, one was torn in pieces by his dogs, the others by his lovers. That of two famous Scipios, the one overthrew the Carthaginians in war, the other totally ruined and destroyed them. The city of Troy was the first time taken by Hercules. I'm not sure how to spell that in Greek or anything. For the horses promised him by Laomedon. The second time by Agamemnon, by means of the celebrated great wooden horse, and the third time by Charidemus, by occasion of a horse falling down at the gate, which hindered the Trojans, so that they could not shut them soon enough, and of two cities which take their names from the most agreeable odoriferous plants, Eos and Smyrna, the one from violet, the other from myrrh. The poet Homer is reported to have been born in the one and to have died in the other. And sometimes these things literally happen. But even if that's the case, what does it mean? Or what does it do? Or, And so to these instances, let us further add that the most warlike commanders and the most remarkable for exploits of skillful stratagem have had but one eye, as Philip, Antigonus, Hannibal, and Sertorius, whose life and actions we describe at present, of whom, indeed, we might truly say that he was more continent than Philip, more faithful to his friends than Antigonus, and more merciful to his enemies than Hannibal, and that for prudence and judgment he gave place to none of them, but in fortune was inferior to them all. Yet though he had continually in her a far more difficult adversary to contend against than his open enemies, he nevertheless maintained his ground with the military skill of Metellus, the boldness of Pompey, the success of Sulla, and the power of the Roman people, all to be encountered by one who is a banished man and a stranger at the head of a body of barbarians. Among Greek commanders, Eumenes of Cardia may be best compared with him. They were, both of them, men born for command, for warfare, and for stratagem, both banished from their countries and holding command over strangers. Both had fortune for their adversary in the last days, so harshly so that they were both betrayed and murdered by those who served them and with whom they had formerly overcome their enemies. Now, if we look at circumstances of coincidences and that sort of stuff, just because you list them out like this doesn't mean this star and this or this other thing is necessarily connected to this, right? Even if you find a couple, because somebody's going to find, it's different because, these other things, but you weren't thinking that when you made their list, or whoever wasn't thinking that when they made their list. And fortune, I guess the divine names, Otter, the the one with the decree, and a dahr, the time. I don't know, there's probably some other name you can attach to it, but just because the material circumstance isn't pleasing doesn't mean that you're not given this opportunity to atone, to attain merit, develop strength or knowledge or whatever. But if you so choose for God to be against you, that's a different story. Quintus Sertorius was of a noble family, born in the city of Nursia, in the country of the Sabines. His father died when he was young, and he was carefully and decently educated by his mother, whose name was Rahab, and whom he appears to have extremely loved and honored. He paid some attention to the study of oratory and pleading in his youth, and acquired some reputation and influence in Rome by his eloquence. But the splendor of his actions in arms and his successful achievements in the wars drew off his ambition in that direction. At his first beginning he served under Capio when Cimbri and Teutones invaded Gaul, where the Romans, fighting unsuccessfully and being put to flight, he was wounded in many parts of his body and lost his horse, yet nevertheless swam across the river Rhone in his armor, with his breastplate and shield, bearing himself against the violence of the current. So strong and so well inured to hardship was his body. The second time that the Cimbri and the Teutons came down with some hundreds of thousands, threatening death and destruction to all, when it was no small piece of service for a Roman soldier to keep his ranks and obey his commander. Sertorius undertook, while Marius led the army, to spy out the enemy's camp, procuring a Celtic dress and acquainting himself with the ordinary expressions of their language requisite for common intercourse. He threw himself in amongst the barbarians, where, having carefully seen with his own eyes, or having been fully informed by persons upon the place of all their most important concerns, he returned to Marius, from whose hands he received the rewards of valor, and afterwards giving frequent proof both of conduct and courage in all the following war, he was advanced to places of honor and trust under his general. After the wars with the Cimbri and the Teutons, he was sent into Spain, having the command of 1,000 men, under Didius, the Roman general, and wintered in the country of Celtiberians, in the city of Castulo, where the soldiers, enjoying a great plenty, and growing insolent, and continually drinking, the inhabitants despised them and sent for aid by night to the Grysonians, their near neighbors, who fell upon the Romans in their lodgings, and slew a great number of them. Sertorius, with a few of his soldiers, made his way out, and rallying together the rest who escaped, he marched around about the walls, and finding the gate open by which the Grysonians had made their secret entrance, he gave not them the same opportunity, but, placing a guard at the gate, and seizing upon all the quarters of the city, he slew all who were of age to bear arms, and then ordering his soldiers to lay aside their weapons, and to put off their own clothes, and put on the accoutrements of the barbarians. They just mean they weren't Greeks. Just like the Jews saying Gentile. It's not really the way to talk about people. You can say foreigners without saying that. He commanded them to follow him to the city from whence the men came who had made this night attack upon the Romans, and thus deceiving the Grysonians with the sight of their own armor, he found the gates of their city open, and took a great number prisoners, who came out thinking to meet their friends and fellow citizens, come home from a successful expedition. Most of them were thus slain by the Romans at their own gates, and the rest within yielded themselves and were sold for slaves. This action made Sertorius highly renowned throughout all Spain, and as soon as he returned to Rome he was appointed quaestor of Cisalpine, Gaul, at a very seasonable moment for his country, the Marsian War being on the point of breaking out. Sertorius was ordered to raise soldiers and provide arms, which he performed with a diligence and alacrity so contrasting with the feebleness and slothfulness of other officers of his age that he got the repute of a man whose life would be one of action, nor did he relinquish the part of a soldier now that he had arrived at the dignity of a commander, but performed wonders with his own hands, and never sparing himself, but exposing his body freely in all conflicts. He lost one of his eyes. This he always esteemed an honor to him, observing that others do not continually carry about with them the marks and testimonies of their valor, but must often lay aside their chains of gold, their spears, and their crowns, whereas his ensigns of honor and the manifestations of his courage always remained with him, and those who beheld his misfortune must at the same time recognize his merits. The people also paid him the respect he deserved, and when he came into the theatre received him with plaudits and joyful acclamations, an honor rarely bestowed even on the persons of advanced standing and established reputation. Notwithstanding this popularity, when he stood to be tribune of the people, he was disappointed and lost the place, being opposed by the party of Sulla, which seems to have been the principal cause of his subsequent enmity to Sulla. After that, Marius was overcome by Sulla and fled into Africa, and Sulla had left Italy to go to the wars against Mithridates, and of the two consuls, Octavius and Cinna, Octavius remained steadfast to the policy of Sulla, but Cinna, desirous of a new revolution, attempted to recall the lost interest of Marius. Sertorius joined Cinna's party, more particularly as he saw that Octavius was not very capable, and was also suspicious of anyone that was a friend to Marius. When a great battle was fought between the two consuls in the Forum, Octavius overcame, and Cinna and Sertorius, having lost not less than 10,000 men, left the city, and gaining over most part of the troops who were dispersed about, remained still in many parts of Italy. They in a short time mustered up a force against Octavius, sufficient to give him battle again, and Marius also, now coming by sea out of Africa, proffered himself to serve under Cinna as a private soldier under his consul and commander. Most were for the immediate reception of Marius, but Sertorius openly declared against it, whether he thought that Cinna would not now pay as much attention to himself when a man of higher military repute was present, or feared that the violence of Marius would bring all things to confusion by his boundless wrath and vengeance after victory. He insisted upon it with Cinna that they were already victorious, that there remained little to be done, and that if they admitted Marius, he would deprive them of the glory and advantage of the war, as there was no man less easy to deal with, or less to be trusted in as a partner in power. Cinna answered that Sertorius rightly judged the affair, but that he himself was at a loss and ashamed, and knew not how to reject him after he had sent for him to share in his fortunes. To which Sertorius immediately replied that he had thought that Marius came into Italy of his own accord, and therefore had deliberated as to what might have been most expedient, but that Cinna ought not so much have questioned whether he should accept him whom he had already invited, but should have honorably received and employed him, for his word once passed left no room for debate. Thus Marius being sent for by Cinna, and their forces being divided into 3 parts under Cinna, Marius, and Sertorius, the war was brought to a successful conclusion. But those about Cinna and Marius, committing all manner of insolence and cruelty, made the Romans think the evils of war a golden time in comparison. On the contrary, it is reported of Sertorius that he never slew any man in his anger to satisfy his own private revenge, nor ever insulted over anyone whom he had overcome, but was much offended with Marius, and often privately entreated Cinna to use his power more moderately. And in the end, when the slaves whom Marius had freed at his landing to increase his army, being made not only his fellow soldiers in the war, but also now his guard in his usurpation, enriched and powerful by his favor, either by the command or permission of Marius, or by their own lawless violence, committed all sorts of crimes, killed their masters, ravished their masters' wives, and abused their children. Their conduct appeared so intolerable to Sertorius that he slew the whole body of them, 4,000 in number, commanding his soldiers to shoot them down with their javelins as they lay encamped together. Now that's a good leader. Because it's not your, because even if it's not of your own group, you shouldn't tolerate this of your, the people you rule over, whether you're in general or whatever. And following World War II, the great atrocities against the German people, or at the end of, or whatever, it's just, something that shouldn't have been done, and the German people did atrocities too, but, it's not acceptable for either side. Afterwards, when Marius died, and Cinna shortly after was slain, when the younger Marius made himself consul against Sertorius' wishes, and contrary to law, when Carbo, Norbanus, and Scipio fought unsuccessfully against Sulla, now advancing to Rome, when much was lost by the cowardice and remissness of the commanders, but more by the treachery of their party, when, with the want of prudence in the chief leaders, all went so ill that his presence could do no good, in the end, when Sulla had placed his camp near to Scipio, and by pretending friendship and putting him in hopes of a peace, corrupted his army, and Scipio could not be made sensible of this, although often forewarned of it by Sertorius. At last he utterly despaired of Rome, and hastened into Spain, that by taking possession there beforehand, he might secure a refuge to his friends from their misfortunes at home, having bad weather in his journey, and traveling through mountainous countries, and the inhabitants stopping the way, and demanding a toll and money for passage. Those who were with him were out of all patience at the indignity and shame it would be for a proconsul of Rome to pay tribute to a crew of wretched barbarians. But he little regarded their censure, and slighting that which had only the appearance of an indecency, told them he must buy time, the most precious of all things, to those who go upon great enterprises, and pacifying the barbarous people with money, he hastened his journey and took possession of Spain, a country flourishing and populous, abounding with young men, fit to bear arms, but on account of the insolence and covetousness of the governors from time to time sent thither from Rome, they had generally an aversion to Roman supremacy. He, however, soon gained the affection of their nobles by intercourse with them, and the good opinion of the people by remitting their taxes. But that which won him most popularity was his exempting them from finding lodgings for the soldiers when he commanded his army to take up their winter quarters outside of the cities, and to pitch their camp in the suburbs, and when he himself first of all caused his own tent to be raised without walls, yet not being willing to rely totally upon the good inclination of the inhabitants, he armed all the Romans who lived in those countries that were of military age, and undertook the building of ships and the making of all sorts of warlike engines, by which means he kept the cities in due obedience, showing himself gentle in all peaceful business, and at the same time formidable to his enemies by his great preparations for war. As soon as he was informed that Sulla had made himself master of Rome, and that the party which sided with Marius and Carbo was going to destruction, he expected that some commander with a considerable army would speedily come against him, and therefore sent away Julius Salinator immediately, with 6,000 men fully armed, to fortify and defend the passes of the Pyrenees. And Caius Annius, not long after being sent out by Sulla, finding Julius unassailable, sat down short at the foot of the mountains in perplexity, but ascertained Calpurnius, surnamed Lenarius, having treacherously slain Julius, and his soldiers, and forsaking the heights of the Pyrenees, Caius Annius advanced with large numbers, and drove before him all who endeavored to hinder his march. Sertorius also, not being strong enough to give him battle, retreated with 3,000 men into New Carthage, where he took shipping and crossed seas into Africa, and coming near the coast of Mauritania, his men went on shore to water, and straggling about negligently, the natives fell upon them and slew a great number. This new misfortune forced him to sail back again into Spain, whence he was also repulsed, and also some Cilician private ships. Joining with him, they made for the island of Pitasa, where they landed and overpowered the garrison placed there by Annius, who, however, came not long after with a great fleet of ships, 5,000 soldiers, and Sertorius made ready to fight him by sea, although his ships were not built for strength, but for lightness and swift sailing. But a violent west wind raised such a sea that many of them were run aground and shipwrecked, and he himself, with a few vessels, being kept from putting further out to sea by the fury of the weather, and from landing by the power of his enemies, were tossed about painfully for 10 days together amidst the boisterous and adverse waves. He escaped with difficulty, and after the wind ceased, ran for certain desert islands scattered in those seas, affording no water, and after passing a night there, making out to sea again. He went through the straits of Cadiz, and, sailing outward, keeping the Spanish shore on his right hand, landed a little above the mouth of the river Batis, where it falls into the Atlantic Sea and gives the name to that part of Spain. Here he met with seamen recently arrived from the Atlantic islands, 2 in number, divided from one another only by a narrow channel, and distant from the coast of Africa 10,000 furlongs. These are called the Islands of the Blessed. Rain falls there seldom, and in moderate showers, but for the most part they have gentle breezes, bringing along with them soft dews, which render the soil not only rich for plowing and planting, but so abundantly fruitful that it produces spontaneously an abundance of delicate fruits, sufficient to feed the inhabitants, who may here enjoy all things without trouble or labor. The seasons of the year are temperate, and the transitions from one to another so moderate that the air is almost always serene and pleasant. The rough northerly and easterly winds which blow from the coasts of Europe and Africa, dissipated in the vast open space, utterly lose their force before they reach the islands. The soft western and southerly winds which breathe upon them sometimes produce gentle sprinkling showers, which they convey along with them from the sea, but more usually bring days of moist, bright weather, cooling and gently fertilizing the soil, so that the firm belief prevails even among the barbarians that this is the seat of the blessed, and that these are the Elysian fields celebrated by Homer. Well, just like Jesus really taught, well, this is like Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom. We're the hereafter. If we're talking about the hereafter, we got to use metaphors that refer to this life, but doesn't mean that we really, we go, if you're really bad, you go south of Jerusalem, and if you're really good, you float around in the sky. That's not always what's being said. Sometimes they make clear that they're drawing a comparison. When Sertorius heard this account, he was seized with a wonderful passion for these islands, and had an extreme desire to go and live there in peace and quietness, and safe from oppression and unending wars. But his inclinations being perceived by the Cilician pirates, who desired not peace nor quiet, but riches and spoils, they immediately forsook him, and sailed away into Africa to assist Ascalis, the son of Iftha, and to help to restore him to his kingdom of Mauritania. Now, that is probably not the same as the Fagama. The is probably like that fum, the like the Sanskrit people say it's closer to a W sound, but I don't think. And like the Q. So why was the F and the Q omitted in later Greek usage? I don't know that one. That doesn't really relate, but you know what I mean. Because there's two numbers that are left out by doing that. Their sudden departure nowadays discouraged Sertorius. He presently resolved to assist the enemies of Ascalis, and by this new adventure trusted to keep his soldiers together, who from this might conceive new hopes and a prospect of a new scene of action. His arrival in Mauritania being very acceptable to the Moors, he lost no time, but immediately giving battle to Ascalis, beat him out of the field and besieged him, and Pacianus, being sent by Sulla with a powerful supply to raise the siege, Sertorius slew him in the field, and gained over all his forces, and took the city of Tingis, into which Ascalis and his brothers were fled for refuge. The Africans tell that Antaeus was buried in the city, and Sertorius had the grave opened, doubting the story because of the prodigious size, and finding there his body in effect, it is said, full 60 cubits long. He was infinitely astonished, offered sacrifice, and heaped up the tomb again, gave his confirmation of the story, and added